He went to sleep, shivering on the dirt floor of a collapsed Nevada silver mine, a forgotten veteran with nothing but a frayed sleeping bag and haunting memories. By morning, a freak rock slide revealed a secret sealed for a century, thrusting him into a deadly, multi-million-dollar nightmare. The wind howling across the high Nevada desert felt less like weather and more like a physical assault. It was late October 2021, and the temperature along Highway 95, just outside the fading town of Tonopah, was plummeting toward freezing. For Nathaniel Brody, the biting cold was just another adversary in a long war that had never truly ended. Nathaniel was 42 years old, though the deep lines etching his face and the permanent exhaustion in his pale blue eyes made him look significantly older. A former Marine combat engineer, he had spent 2 tours dismantling improvised explosive devices in the dust-choked streets of Helmand Province. He had survived the shrapnel, the ambushes, and the deafening blasts that still echoed in his nightmares. But surviving the peace back home had proven to be an impossible mission. The VA system in Reno had tried to help, but the sterile white walls and the constant hum of fluorescent lights triggered a claustrophobic panic Nathaniel could rarely suppress. He couldn't hold down a job, couldn't maintain a lease, and eventually, the margins of society had simply swallowed him whole. For 3 years, he had been a ghost haunting the American West, living out of a weathered canvas rucksack, seeking only isolation and silence. Tonopah was usually a safe place to pass through, a town that understood the desire to be left alone. But a freak early-season blizzard was rolling over the San Antonio mountains, threatening to drop a lethal blanket of snow and sub-zero temperatures over the region. The few local shelters were already turning people away, packed to the brim. Even if there had been an empty cot, Nathaniel's severe PTSD made sleeping in a room full of unpredictable strangers a psychological impossibility. He needed shelter, and he needed it away from civilization. Months prior, while wandering the desolate scrubland 10 miles east of the town, Nathaniel had stumbled upon the forgotten remnants of the Liberty Bell mining district. It was a scar on the earth left over from the silver boom of the late 1800s. Amidst the rusted tailings and collapsed wooden head frames, he had found an old horizontal adit, a tunnel carved directly into the side of a steep, rocky ravine. The entrance was partially obscured by decades of rockfall and overgrown sagebrush, making it invisible to off-roaders and casual hikers. With the sky bruising into a violent, stormy purple, Nathaniel adjusted the heavy straps of his rucksack and began the grueling trek toward the ravine. The wind whipped coarse sand against his face, stinging his skin. By the time he reached the hidden entrance of the mine, his hands were entirely numb, and his breath was pluming in thick white clouds. He slipped through the narrow gap between the collapsed timber supports, instantly feeling the heavy, dead silence of the underground. The temperature inside the shaft was a constant, damp 50 degrees. Chilly, but a life-saving sanctuary compared to the lethal blizzard screaming outside. Using his military-issue tactical flashlight, Nathaniel scanned the tunnel. It was a classic 19th-century drift, about 7 feet high and reinforced with ancient, petrified Douglas fir timbers. The air smelled of oxidized copper, damp earth, and the faint, sweet decay of old wood. As a former engineer, he instinctively checked the structural integrity of the ceiling. The rock looked surprisingly solid, cut straight through dense basalt. He set up his meager camp about 50 feet deep into the tunnel, well past the reach of the wind, but close enough to see the faint gray light of the entrance. He unrolled his military surplus foam pad and his patched sleeping bag. Dinner was a half-eaten sleeve of saltine crackers and a lukewarm canteen of water. Sitting in the oppressive dark, listening to the muffled roar of the snowstorm outside, Nathaniel felt the familiar, heavy weight of his isolation. He was a man who had sacrificed his youth and his sanity for his country, only to find himself huddled in a hole in the earth like a stray animal. He wrapped the sleeping bag tightly around his shoulders, closed his eyes and waited for the dawn, praying the mountain wouldn't decide to bury him in his sleep. Nathaniel survived the first night, but the storm did not break. For 36 hours, the blizzard raged across the Nevada high desert, dumping feet of heavy, wet snow. Trapped inside the mine, Nathaniel conserved his flashlight battery and rationing his dwindling water supply. The absolute darkness of the shaft was disorienting, playing cruel tricks on his trauma-wired brain. Shadows seemed to writhe, and the steady dripping of condensation sounded like distant, rhythmic footsteps. On the evening of the second day, the earth began to groan. It started as a low, subsonic vibration that vibrated through the soles of Nathaniel's worn combat boots. Then came a sharp, deafening crack, like the report of an artillery shell, echoing from deep within the bowels of the mountain. Nathaniel threw himself against the tunnel wall, his heart hammering against his ribs as years of combat training hijacked his nervous system. A cloud of thick, choking dust rolled past him, smelling intensely of sulfur and crushed stone. He waited for the ceiling to come down, for the crushing weight of the mountain to end it all. But the final collapse never came. Coughing and waving the dust away, he clicked his flashlight on. The beam cut through the particulate-heavy air. The ceiling above him was completely intact. The collapse hadn't happened overhead. It had happened deeper inside the mine. Curiosity, heavily laced with a survivor's need to secure his perimeter, drove Nathaniel forward. He pulled a heavy steel pry bar from his pack, a tool he carried for scavenging, and cautiously moved down the tunnel. About 30 yards past his camp, the adit took a sharp left turn. When he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. The back wall of the tunnel, which had previously looked like a solid dead end of jagged rock, had partially caved in. The heavy snowmelt from the blizzard had seeped through the porous basalt, undermining a cleverly disguised false wall built from stacked stones and plastered with mud. The water had washed away the ancient mortar, causing the entire facade to slump forward. Behind the collapsed rubble, the beam of his flashlight revealed an artificial hollow, a secret secondary chamber that was never recorded on any mining map. Nathaniel climbed over the pile of fallen rocks, his boots crunching loudly in the eerie silence. The air inside the hidden chamber was incredibly stale, untouched by oxygen for over a century. The room was small, roughly 10 by 10 feet, and entirely lined with thick, heavy timbers to prevent any cave-ins. In the center of the room sat 3 massive, iron-banded wooden lock boxes. They were covered in a thick layer of white dust and draped in the brittle, mummified remains of heavy canvas tarps. Nathaniel approached the nearest box, his hands trembling slightly. He knelt in the dirt, wiping the dust away from the heavy iron lid. Faint, stenciled black lettering emerged from the grime. Property of the C.C. Mint, transit batch. 404, 1893. Nathaniel's breath hitched. C.C. Mint, the legendary Carson City Mint. He wedged the flat edge of his steel pry bar beneath the heavy iron hasp of the lockbox. The ancient padlock, rusted and degraded by a century of subterranean moisture, snapped with a sharp, brittle crunch. Nathaniel threw his weight into the bar, prying the heavy lid upward. Its rusted hinges shrieked in protest before the lid finally slammed backward against the cavern wall. Nathaniel aimed his flashlight into the box, and the reflection nearly blinded him. It wasn't raw, unrefined silver ore. The box was packed to the brim with tightly bound, wax-sealed canvas sacks, several of which had rotted open over the decades. Spilling out of the torn fabric was a mountain of pristine, uncirculated Morgan silver dollars. But that wasn't what made Nathaniel's heart stop. Nestled beneath the silver were dozens of dull, heavy, rectangular bricks. Gold bullion. Nathaniel reached out, his calloused, freezing fingers closing around one of the bricks. He lifted it. It weighed nearly 25 pounds, incredibly dense and remarkably cold. Stamped into the face of the gold was the undeniable seal of the United States assayer. He was looking at a fortune. Based on the sheer volume of the 3 crates, there had to be millions of dollars in rare historical coins and raw gold sitting in the dirt. His mind raced, trying to piece together the history. In the late 19th century, stagecoach robberies were rampant across the Nevada Territory. Outlaws would often hijack bullion shipments destined for San Francisco, hiding the loot in abandoned mine shafts with the intention of returning when the heat died down. Whoever had hidden this staggering fortune had sealed the wall perfectly, only to likely meet their end at the end of a sheriff's rope or in a barroom gunfight, taking the secret of the location to their grave. For 10 minutes, Nathaniel just sat in the dirt, holding the gold brick. The reality of the situation crashed over him in terrifying waves. He was a homeless veteran with no fixed address, no bank account, and no legal claim to the land he was trespassing on. If the authorities found out, the government would seize every single coin, and he would likely be arrested for looting historical artifacts. If word got out to the wrong kind of people, he would simply be murdered, his body left to rot in the very shaft where he found the treasure. He needed a plan. He needed to extract just enough to get himself on his feet, find someone trustworthy to fence it, and figure out how to launder the rest without drawing the attention of the federal government or the ruthless criminal elements that operated out of Las Vegas. Nathaniel carefully placed the gold bar back into the chest and closed the lid. He needed to pack his camp and camouflage the collapsed wall as best he could until he could return with a vehicle and proper equipment. He turned around to head back to his camp, swinging his flashlight beam toward the tunnel entrance. The beam swept across the dusty floor of the adit, and Nathaniel froze. Adrenaline flooded his system, completely overriding the awe of the treasure. There, clearly imprinted in the thick, undisturbed dust of the tunnel floor, was a fresh boot print. It was a heavy, lug-soled tread, modern, expensive, and far too large to be his own. It was pointed directly toward the hidden chamber. Worse, just a few feet away from the footprint, resting on a rock outcropping, was a small, black object that hadn't been there an hour ago. Nathaniel slowly approached it, his hand instinctively dropping to the heavy tactical knife strapped to his thigh. It was a modern, high-end digital radio communicator. Its small green LED light was blinking silently in the dark. Someone else was in the mine, and they already knew what was behind the wall. Nathaniel's thumb moved with practiced, mechanical precision, instantly clicking off his tactical flashlight. The sudden absence of the beam plunged the narrow, subterranean tunnel into an abyss of absolute, suffocating darkness. His breathing slowed to a barely perceptible rhythm, an automatic physiological response drilled into him during his tours in the deadly, labyrinthine alleyways of Helmand Province. The overwhelming rush of finding the lost Carson City Mint treasure evaporated, instantly replaced by the icy, hyper-focused clarity of a combat veteran entering a hostile engagement. He was trapped in a single-entry fatal funnel, Whoever had dropped that high-end digital radio communicator was between him and the only exit. Crouching low against the freezing, damp rock wall, Nathaniel strained his ears, separating the natural sounds of the groaning mountain from the artificial noises of human intrusion. He could hear nothing but the faint dripping of condensation and the distant, muffled howling of the blizzard raging outside. Yet the blinking green LED light of the dropped radio, sitting ominously on the rock outcropping 50 feet away, served as a beacon of imminent lethal danger. His mind raced, swiftly processing the terrifying reality of his situation. This was no accidental encounter. The Liberty Bell mining district had been dead and forgotten for a century. The fact that heavily equipped individuals were braving a catastrophic high desert blizzard to enter this specific adit meant they possessed exact, historical intelligence. In the total darkness, Nathaniel drew his military-issue Ka-Bar combat knife from its thigh sheath. The heavy carbon steel blade felt like an old, trusted friend in his calloused hand. As a former combat engineer, he rapidly began to formulate a tactical assessment of his bleak environment. Environmental concealment, total absence of ambient light. This favored the defender, provided the intruders were relying on standard illumination. Acoustic vulnerability. The basalt walls created massive echoes. Any misstep on the loose, rocky tailings would broadcast his exact position like a gunshot. Structural integrity. Severely compromised. The recent secondary collapse proved the centuries-old Douglas fire support timbers were under immense failing pressure from the heavy snowmelt above. Ammunition and armament. Nathaniel was completely unarmed save for a 7-inch blade and a heavy steel prybar. The intruders were undoubtedly carrying firearms. Suddenly, the suffocating silence was violently broken. A sharp, distinct burst of static erupted from the black radio resting on the rocks, followed immediately by a harsh, synthesized voice breaking through the encrypted frequency. Bravo 2, this is actual. We found his primary camp near the entrance. Rucksack, military surplus gear, 0 signs of a vehicle outside. It's just one transient. The blizzard must have driven him underground. We are moving to secure the primary target zone. If he interferes, terminate him and leave him in the shaft. Acknowledge. Nathaniel's blood ran cold, yet his heart rate remained remarkably steady. The transmission confirmed his worst fears. These were not amateur scavengers or lost hikers. They were highly organized, heavily financed, and operating with a brutal paramilitia mindset. The term primary target zone meant they definitively knew about the fake wall and the millions of dollars in uncirculated Morgan silver and Asaya gold resting behind it. A moment later, a terrifying realization washed over him. The intruders hadn't turned on any flashlights. The tunnel remained pitch black, yet the radio transmission indicated they were actively advancing down the shaft. There was only one tactical explanation for moving aggressively through total darkness in a collapsed mine. They were equipped with thermal or night vision optics. To them, the pitch-black tunnel was glowing in stark monochrome green or thermal heat signatures. If Nathaniel remained stationary, his own body heat would light him up like a flare on their scopes. He had to move, and he had to alter the environment to neutralize their immense technological advantage. Dropping to his hands and knees, Nathaniel crawled backward toward the hidden chamber, his fingertips lightly tracing the jagged grooves of the mine wall to guide him. The air grew thicker, heavy with the ancient, undisturbed dust of the collapsed false wall. As he reached the threshold of the secret treasure room, he realized he could not simply fight his way out. He had to use the mountain itself as his primary weapon. He vividly recalled the layout of the old Douglas fir timber sets that supported the main tunnel ceiling just outside the treasure chamber. Combat engineers were trained specifically to understand load-bearing architecture, primarily to demolish it efficiently. Nathaniel knew what he had to do. It was a terrifying, suicidal gamble, an engineer's gambit. He would trigger a localized cave-in, precisely calculated to crush the intruders, bury the primary tunnel, and hopefully leave the small treasure chamber intact. It would mean entombing himself with the millions in gold, relying entirely on the fragile hope that he could dig his way out through the fresh rubble before the oxygen supply ran out. He gripped his heavy steel pry bar, positioning himself directly beside the splintered left vertical stull. He pressed his back tightly against the cold stone, regulating his breathing, preparing to bring the mountain down. Faintly, over the sound of his own heartbeat, he heard the unmistakable crunch of heavy tactical boots stepping onto loose gravel. They were closing in. The intruders advanced with agonizingly slow, deliberate precision. Through the heavy, sulfur-tinged darkness, Nathaniel could faintly smell the sharp, distinct metallic odor of modern gun oil and the synthetic scent of high-grade tactical gear. They were mere yards away, just around the final sharp bend of the adit. "Actual, this is Bravo 2, a low, gruff voice whispered from the darkness just around the corner. "I have heat signatures in the dust, fresh prints. The transient found the breach. He's inside the secondary chamber." "Understood," came the chillingly calm reply through a nearby earpiece. "Switching from thermal to active infrared illumination. Flashbang the room, clear the transient, and secure the transit boxes. We have a 3-hour window before the storm breaks and the local plows hit Highway 95. The mention of active infrared illumination sent a jolt of urgency through Nathaniel's nervous system. If they switched their night vision goggles to active IR, they would flood the tunnel with invisible light, instantly exposing his position behind the wooden support timber. His window of opportunity was rapidly closing to a matter of seconds. He didn't wait for the flashbang. Channeling every ounce of his raw, adrenaline-fueled strength, Nathaniel swung the heavy steel pry bar like a baseball bat, aiming perfectly for the rotted, splintered base of the left vertical stull. The heavy iron bar collided with the ancient Douglas fir with a deafening, catastrophic crack that echoed like thunder throughout the subterranean cavern. The structural failure was instantaneous and violently spectacular. The removal of the critical load-bearing timber caused the massive overhead crossbeam to snap completely in half under the immense weight of the mountain above. Thousands of pounds of loose basalt, shale, and heavy, wet earth instantly poured through the ceiling in a lethal, crushing waterfall of stone and dust. The violent cascade of rock completely obliterated the tunnel just 10 feet in front of Nathaniel, filling the air with a blinding, choking cloud of pulverized minerals. Over the deafening roar of the cave-in, Nathaniel heard the muffled, panicked screams of the two intruders as the edge of the rock slide caught them, followed by the terrifying, chaotic clatter of automatic weapons discharging blindly into the ceiling as they scrambled backward to avoid being crushed alive. Nathaniel threw himself backward into the secret treasure chamber, covering his head with his arms as the entrance to his small sanctuary was violently pelted with flying debris. The ground shook violently for 30 agonizing seconds, the mountain settling its massive weight into the newly created void. Then an eerie, suffocating silence returned. Nathaniel coughed violently, his lungs burning from the thick, acidic dust. He fumbled in his tactical webbing, finally clicking on his flashlight. The beam illuminated a terrifying reality. The main tunnel was entirely gone, replaced by a solid, impassable wall of jagged, compacted rock. The intruders were cut off, likely fleeing for the entrance if they had survived the collapse. But Nathaniel was now sealed inside a 10 by 10 foot tomb with 3 centuries-old lockboxes of unfathomable wealth. Panic, dark and primal, threatened to claw its way up his throat. He forced it down, relying on the cold, mechanical discipline of his marine training. Panic was a luxury for the dying. Survival required immediate, calculated action. He realized that the cave-in had altered the air pressure in the room. A faint, icy draft was brushing against the back of his neck, cutting through the stagnant, dusty air. He swung the flashlight toward the rear of the small chamber. Behind the massive wooden lockboxes, the collapse of the false wall had revealed a narrow, natural fissure in the bedrock, a secondary ventilation shaft created by a geological fault line, completely unmapped by the original 19th century miners. It was impossibly narrow, jagged, and pitched upward at a severe, punishing angle, but the frigid air blowing down from it smelled faintly of fresh pine and freezing snow. It was a secondary exit to the surface. Time was critical. He had no idea how much oxygen remained in the sealed chamber, nor did he know if the heavily armed intruders would return with digging equipment once the dust settled. He had to move, but he refused to leave empty-handed. His days of sleeping in the dirt, of freezing in the margins of a society that had forgotten his sacrifice, were permanently over. Nathaniel quickly opened his heavy canvas rucksack and dumped his meager, worthless possessions onto the dirt floor. He dropped to his knees beside the splintered lockboxes. He moved with frantic purpose, ignoring the historical awe of the moment. He bypassed the raw gold bullion bricks. They were 25 pounds each, far too heavy and dense to carry up a steep, narrow vertical climb, without completely exhausting his muscles or getting wedged in the fissure. Instead, he focused entirely on the tightly bound, wax-sealed canvas sacks of Carson City Morgan silver dollars. He shoved 4 of the heavy sacks into the bottom of his rucksack, distributing the weight evenly. Each sack likely held hundreds of pristine, uncirculated coins, each potentially worth tens of thousands of dollars to the right collector. The total weight was nearly 40 pounds, a punishing burden, but manageable for a man accustomed to carrying heavy explosive ordnance across the Afghan desert. Slinging the heavy pack over his shoulders, he fastened the sternum strap tight across his chest. He approached the narrow fissure, squeezed his broad shoulders into the jagged gap, and began the agonizing claustrophobic climb toward the surface. For 2 grueling hours, Nathaniel fought his way upward through the mountain. The sharp rocks tore at his clothing and sliced his hands, his muscles screaming in burning agony under the brutal weight of the silver. But the promise of a new life, of true independence and unassailable security, fueled his desperate ascent. Finally, his bleeding hands broke through a layer of hard-packed earth and freezing snow. He hoisted himself out of the narrow fissure, collapsing onto the frozen, wind-scoured surface of the San Antonio Mountains. The blizzard had finally broken. The early morning sky above the Nevada desert was a brilliant, blinding, cloudless blue. The frigid air filled his burning lungs, and for the first time in 3 long, agonizing years, Nathaniel Brody felt truly alive. 4 days later, over 400 miles away, Nathaniel walked into the opulent, highly secure offices of Caldwell Numismatics in the heart of Las Vegas. He bypassed the glittering, tourist-filled casino floors and demanded a private meeting with Harrison Caldwell, a legendary, notoriously discreet dealer specializing in rare 19th-century American currency. When Nathaniel unceremoniously dumped the 4 dirt-caked, wax-sealed canvas sacks onto Caldwell's polished mahogany desk, the elderly dealer's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated disbelief. The pristine, uncirculated Carson City Morgans from the lost 1893 transit batch were a numismatic holy grail. Caldwell, bound by a lucrative non-disclosure agreement and a staggering commission fee, quietly brokered the sale of the coins through a series of anonymous, high-end private auctions over the next 6 months. The total net yield after laundering the funds through a newly established, ironclad trust account was just over $12.4 million. Nathaniel never returned to Tonopah, nor did he ever report the remaining gold bullion sitting in the dark depths of the collapsed mine. Let the cartel-backed treasure hunters spend the rest of their miserable lives digging through the rubble for ghosts. Today, Nathaniel Brody lives on a sprawling 3,000-acre private ranch nestled deep in the heavily forested mountains of western Montana. The property is heavily secured, entirely off the grid and completely sealant, save for the wind blowing through the towering pines. He established a quiet, heavily endowed philanthropic foundation that anonymously purchases massive tracts of rural land, converting them into secure, private retreats specifically designed to house and treat homeless combat veterans suffering from severe PTSD. He finally found his peace, bought and paid for by a forgotten mountain, a crumbling wall, and the heavy, undeniable weight of history. If Nathaniel's incredible journey from the cold, forgotten depths of an abandoned Nevada silver mine to finding peace and a multi-million-dollar treasure kept you on the edge of your seat, make sure to like this video. Share this breathtaking real-life story of survival, military grit, and hidden history with your friends. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another thrilling